We're now going to talk about the architecture and the mosaics in the Church of Santa Maria Maggiore in Rome. Santa Maria Maggiore was erected somewhere around 432 to 440. And it was built by Pope Sixtus III. It's a basilica church, and it is the first major church dedicated to Mary, the mother of Jesus. And you can see that in the name, Maria, Mary, Maggiore, major. Now, like all early Christian churches, there is additional decoration and remodeling that has been done to this. In 1290, so late 13th century, the transept was added. And that has been redecorated many times. So we're not going to talk about the apse mosaic here, but we're going to talk about some mosaics along the nave, and then some on the arch that separates the nave from the apse. And those are the 4th century mosaics. There's some very interesting things about this church. There was a legend about the founding of it, which was that there was a miraculous snowfall in July, and it fell in the shape of a basilica church. And so the Pope goes out and outlines the edge of the basilica. And this, of course, gives rise to one of Mary's titles, the Virgin of the Snows, or Mary of the Snow. The church contains a relic that is believed to be the manger in which the baby Jesus was laid. And we'll be taking a little closer look, but you can see that there are Ionic columns running down the sides of the nave. Ionic columns sometimes were seen as feminine. They weren't only used for female deities, but because they were very graceful, they had the curve of the scroll, they were sometimes considered to be appropriate for a female deity in ancient classical times. But of course, Christianity has no female deities, so in this case it becomes their most honored woman, the Mother of God. All right, now I need to explain that. This building, this church, was erected to honor Mary, the Mother of God, the Mother of Christ, right after the Council of Ephesus of 431. That's why I give you this very specific date here. In 431, at Ephesus, there was a church council. It was kind of messy. People from one side showed up and didn't wait for the other side to come and declared their views correct. And then the other side shows up and says, no, their side's wrong, and they throw everybody in jail. Church councils do seem to be, I was going to say battling egos. But at any rate, the question that they were dealing with the Council of Ephesus is Mary. And there was a view that was condemned, becomes a heresy, of Nestorianism, which said that Mary was not the Theotokos. Theotokos is the Greek word for God-bearer, or in Latin it would become the Mother of God. The Nestorians said that Mary was not the Mother of God, was not the God-bearer, but only the mother of the human aspect of Jesus, and that Jesus' divinity was confirmed by God the Father. In other words, Nestorius, the theologian who proposed this, said that Christ has two persons, human and divine, rather than two natures in one person. Now, this view was condemned. The Orthodox view was that Christ had two inseparable natures, both human and divine, in one person. You can't split Christ's two natures. He can't be divine on Tuesdays and Thursdays and Saturdays and Sundays, and human on Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays. You know, they're always combined. And if they are always combined and Mary gave birth to Jesus, to Christ, then she must be the mother of God, the divine part, his divine nature, as well as the mother of the human Jesus. So she is given the title Theotokos, or Mother of God, God-bearer. Now, there was also a church council, the Council of Chalcedon, in 451. And at this council, they condemned monophysitism. And that comes from the Greek word monos, meaning one or alone, and physis, meaning nature. The monophysites said that Christ was wholly divine. He only had the appearance of humanity. Monophysites were extremely strong in the Byzantine world. And because of this heresy, in 482, the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, presiding over the Western Church, condemned the entire Eastern Church because of the Monophysite heresy. And there was a schism between the Eastern Church, or the Greek Orthodox, and the Western Church, the Latin Church, which we later came to call Roman Catholic. And that schism at that point lasted for 35 years. Later on, there is a great schism that separates the Eastern and Western churches, and that occurs in the 11th century, in 1054. Okay, so we're going to go back now to 431. Mary has been declared the Mother of God. And so the following year, in honor of Mary, fresh from the victory over the Nestorians, we see the foundation of this large church, Santa Maria Maggiore, in Rome, to honor the Mother of God, the Queen of Heaven. And we'll see when we look at the triumphal arch motifs, the images up on the arch, that these will be Marian images, and the iconography will confirm her new position. The apse mosaic, which is now lost, now there is a 13th century coronation of the Virgin, but the original apse mosaic depicted Mary crowned as Queen of Heaven. And we're going to see the triumphal arch images showing Mary's new status, because those do survive. There are two groups of 5th century glass mosaics in Santa Maria Maggiore. They differ in style and in subject. The first group we're going to look at are Old Testament narrative scenes, which are on the nave wall above the colonnade. And the second set that we're going to look at is on the triumphal arch, or the arch that separates the apse from the nave. And these have scenes of the infancy and childhood of Christ. So first let's look at the Old Testament, some of the Old Testament scenes. These show, they're below the clerestory, above the colonnade, and they show the story of patriarchs who prefigured Christ. People like Abraham, Moses, Joshua. Now, they're very, very interesting because they combine elements of both classical and abstract style, but they are more illusionistic than the triumphal arch mosaics. And they are believed to reflect a lost early Christian Bible illustrations that included this very classical or illusionistic style. One of the sort of jokes that I have about teaching medieval art is that we talk a lot about lost art, work that doesn't exist anymore. But we're looking at work that we believe reflects earlier images. In other words, that the artists who created this didn't just make these up fresh and new, completely from scratch, that they had models. And that makes perfect sense because we've seen over and over again repeated images. So it's believed that they reflect an early Christian Bible that has illustrations with illusionistic style. And as we'll see later, our earliest Christian surviving Bibles, particularly the New Testament images, but they're really 6th century. So the imagery is probably copied or adapted from an earlier illustrated Bible, and this gives us evidence of what the early Bible illustrations may have looked like. Some of the things you're going to see is shading in light and dark. In other words, the tesserae are going to be arranged so that the figures will look solid, that they will have shading. You'll have figures that aren't just lined up looking out, they appear to turn in space. They have different positions. And here we're looking at one of our examples. Okay, at the top we see Abraham greeting the angels. Down below on the right we see him offering food to the angels who are behind a table. You'll notice that the table seems to get wider at the back. This is a way of showing depth that we're not as familiar with because we're used to Renaissance perspective, but this is sometimes called Byzantine perspective, although here you see it in the early Christian period. There's a vessel that is shaded down below. And then on the left, we see Abraham talking to his wife, Sarah. She's laying out the food, presumably, that he's going to take to the angels. But you may remember that the angels prophesied that Abraham would be the father of a great nation, and that his wife, Sarah, who was 80 years old, would give birth to a son. And she really thought that was probably very unlikely. But as it turned out, she did give birth to Isaac, who became the father of the Jewish nation. And here's another example. We see the fall of Jericho and the carrying of the Ark of the Covenant. You'll notice that these are separated as sort of two different registers, and that there's a band going between them. And it has been suggested that this reflects the fact that these may have been taken not from a codex or a book with leaves that's bound on one side, but from a scroll. And so you have this continuous image with a kind of ground line, and here they've taken two images and placed one on top of the other. You can see that the fall of Jericho, you have this walled city, and one wall is simply falling off. You might keep this one in mind because later on we may see some images that remind us of this representation of a city as sort of a cubic form with the roofs of houses and buildings, temples popping up so that we can see them from the top. And then of course you have the army on either side, and they're walking with the Ark of the Covenant and blowing the trumpets, of course, which causes the walls to fall down. Here we see the parting of Abraham and Lot, and you can see the shading and the forms and the fact that the figures can turn and look over their shoulders. And there is Moses parting the Red Sea and the drowning of Pharaoh's army. Now, in this case, it seems like, my goodness, they're all crowded close together. We see, a row of heads to show the Israelites. And we have this point of view where we're looking kind of straight on to Moses, but we're looking down on the Red Sea so we can see the drowning of Pharaoh's army. So there are some elements that are perhaps a little less illusionistic, but you notice that the army is coming through this archway that leads into the city. And if you think back to the Arch of Titus and the image that we saw of the triumphal procession, it's very, very similar. It's at an angle. Here you see the army coming forth, trying to show you the great numbers by putting them very, very close together. And here is a story that's going to be very, very important in Christian art. This is the story of Abraham and Melchizedek. Melchizedek is kind of a one-liner. He's just in a small portion of the Bible. He's mentioned in Genesis 14:18 and referred to again in Psalms 110, verse 4. But he is seen as an Old Testament type or prefiguration for Christ. And also, the verses become part of the liturgy. So these become very, very important in art. Melchizedek is a priest king of Salem, presumably of Jerusalem. And as Abraham is setting out to go to battle, Melchizedek, the priest king of Salem, offers bread and wine to Abraham. So Melchizedek is seen as the Old Testament type for Christ, the priest and king who offers his body and blood, Christ, not Melchizedek, offers his body and blood as the bread and wine of the Eucharist. And there's certainly a reference in Hebrews 5:6. It says, "Thou art a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek." And this is used in the ordination of priests. Now, so very important iconographically, but let's also look at the classical illusion of space. Melchizedek appears to stride forward, and he appears able to turn in space. His weight rests on his forward leg, and he's reaching across his body as he holds up this basket of bread. And the shading is accomplished by bands of tesserae. You can see this, of course, on the figures, particularly as you look. Melchizedek seems to have folds in his tunic. His feet turn. One seems to be a little bit foreshortened even. And then if you look at that great amphora of wine that's in the lower center, you can see that there is a great deal of shading of bands of color that give you the idea that the amphora is actually three-dimensional and solid. You can also see this in the bands of color on the horses' necks and in the horses' chests. And then something that's very, very interesting, if you look at the ground, you see cast shadows. That's C-A-S-T, shadows that are cast because the figure or the object, in the case of this urn or amphora, are presumably between the light source, which seems to be coming in at the upper left, and the body blocks the light, so you have a shadow that falls here on the grass. And this assumes that there's a light source, presumably the windows of the church, but a light source, and solid objects that block the light. Up above, you see a kind of golden background, and then Christ is shown as a heavenly figure pointing down to Melchizedek. He's on these colored clouds, and of course this establishes the relationship between the Old Testament prototype of Christ, the Old Testament type Melchizedek for Christ, who brings not just physical bread and wine, but offers his own spiritual body and blood.